this episode, we confront our fear of the unknown. That is, how could we ever trust someone when their identity remains a mystery? From a very early age, we're taught not to trust strangers. So the idea that anonymity and trust are incompatible are deeply ingrained. Here's how the sociology literature talks about trust. Familiarity is the precondition for trust. Trust is the mutual faithfulness on which all social relationships ultimately depend. And the only alternative to appropriate trust are chaos and paralyzing fear. Yikes, it's a good thing that we have trust. How then is it possible to have social relations in order on the dark web while all parties shield their identity? We'll solve this paradox of trust in 2 steps. First, by narrowing the scope of trust, then by shifting the focus from individual trust to systemic trust. An exact definition of trust remains elusive, but it'll be helpful for us to look under the hood. Trust can be broken down into 2 components, one cognitive, the other affective. So, to trust is to take a leap of faith, to have expectations beyond what reason and experience alone would warrant. The cognitive component of trust, then, is the platform from which we leap. It's the evidence we've gathered of another's trustworthiness. Interestingly, if you were omniscient, you'd have no need to leap. But if you were totally ignorant, you'd have no platform to leap from. The affective component of trust is the emotional bond which parties to a relationship develop. It's what allows us to make emotional investments in others. It's also why a breach of trust doesn't limit itself to the occasion, but strikes at the very core of the relationship. When we trust with affect, we share an understanding that betrayal brings emotional pain to all involved. It thus strengthens our belief that trust will be maintained because the cost of not doing so is high. The affective component thus strengthens the platform from which we take our leap of faith. So, why would you take this leap with complete strangers? People use the dark web to get information, seek advice, publish their views, make purchases, and sell wares. In terms of activity, there's a lot of overlap with the surface web. But the major difference, of course, is that on the dark web, everyone's identity is shielded by default. This notion is baked into the dark web's DNA. So its user base are prompted to shift their expectations, and it puts their affect on guard. The affective dimension of trust is actually what often determines the scope and specificity of our expectations. It's the high affect relationships, like romantic partners, where trust may well be unbounded and extend to situations of all kinds. But for low affect relationships, like buying from a generic online vendor, trust is very specific and limited to discrete expectations. Say that they ship your product on time once you've paid. Most of the interactions on the dark web can be characterized as having low affect. This allows for us to limit the scope of trust on the dark web. The common expectation isn't that you'll develop unbounded relationships over the dark web, but rather that some specific expectation will be met. So this is the first step towards resolving the paradox of trust on the dark web. For the second step, we'll take a close look at the technologies and practices employed. We'll also narrow our focus to dark markets instead of the full dark web, as I think we all have a reasonable understanding of the expectations involved in commercial exchanges. Just to summarize it for you, a vendor lists its products with their descriptions. In exchange for these products, they expect to receive payment. A buyer will make payments for the products they want, but in return, they expect to receive a product that corresponds to the listing. Okay, so now back to the technologies of trust. By far, the most important enabler of trust is cryptography. As we've discussed in episode 7, when anonymity is the default, cryptography allows users to establish trust in each other's online identities through the use of cryptographic signatures. This is a feature of public key cryptography, where a user generates a set of keys, one public, one private. The private key is kept secret and used by a user to sign their online messages. In other words, the combination of their message and secret key generates a code that is published alongside the message. The public key, which is available to all, can then be used to verify that that message was indeed signed by the person who had the secret key. This is the digital equivalent of a handwritten wet signature, hence the name. Since private keys are kept secret, this permits everyone to verify that messages are indeed from the same source. By adopting this practice, dark markets shift from being anonymous to being pseudonymous. In anonymous context, no two messages can be tied to the same account. But with pseudonyms, users can build up a track record that can be cryptographically tied to their online identity. The first thing many dark markets will ask for is your public key. As for many of them, there is no point in facilitating your transactions if you don't permit them to develop trust around you. As even in the dark web, it's trust that allows these markets to exist. See, pseudonyms still have the desirable property of shielding a user's identity, but they also conjure up virtual personas which can build up reputations. For buyers, their reputation can qualify them for discounts and loyalty benefits. Really, it's sometimes strikingly similar to how marketing schemes work in regular e-commerce. Given that some vendors also offer free reshipment on orders which aren't delivered, reputation also allows vendors and markets to weed out cheating buyers. As the saying goes, once is never, but twice is always. As for the vendors, whether they sell physical items like drugs, weapons, or counterfeit money, or services like fake IDs, hacking, or ransomware, the quality of their listings can be highly variable. They could even simply refuse to ship their products after receiving payment. This is where the reputation systems act as a guiding social force. It's what allows vendors to persuade prospective buyers that their offerings are high quality and their delivery swift. It's also why it's so important for vendors to have persistent online identities. Reputation accumulates against it. To build reputation, dark markets stick to the tried and tested method of user feedback, accepting both star-based ratings and text-based reviews. Certain markets even mandate this feedback and enforce this policy by banning users which make multiple purchases without leaving feedback. This system reinforces the social controls which are necessary for the market to exist. So the rationale here is clear. If you aren't interested in facilitating the marketplace has less of an incentive in serving you. The ratings and reviews are also one of the primary reasons why buyers go online instead of dealing with street dealers. Despite the apparent visibility of a local dealer selling from the shadows, buyers typically have less knowledge about the quality of the wares that they peddle. And that's to say nothing of the physical and legal risks involved. It's hard to trust when you fear for your own safety. So the relative security and accountability which the review systems offer strengthen the cognitive dimension of trust. The source of trust is also not just limited to the markets themselves. There are independent onion services which host additional discussions about markets, vendors, and products. One notable example is the Darknet Market Avengers, which is a forum whose members rely on trained chemists to perform random tests on drugs available through dark markets. Another example is Energy Control, a drug testing lab funded by community donations where users send samples of their dark market purchases. This evolving ecosystem further builds out the informational basis upon which cognitive trust is built. The community donations are particularly interesting, as when a market community invests in trust, trust lowers the friction of the market, which in turn strengthens the market community, as the most trusted buyers, products, and vendors come out on top. In this sense, users aren't just anonymous, isolated nodes in a network, but can be seen as conscientious community members and contributors to the commons. This then is also a good example of the cypherpunk ideal of treating information as a public good, just like we discussed in episode 7. The more people have access to quality information, the more people will use it for the common good. These technologies and practices form the missing piece in solving the paradox of trust. In a purely anonymous environment, there can be no trust, as there is no informational basis from which you may build your platform to leap from. In a pseudonymous environment, identity is given a temporal dimension. It can now persist long enough to build up a reputation based on which you may take your leap of faith. Even in the absence of personal familiarity, you may still trust in the market, trust in the network of buyers and sellers, and trust that the feedback is representative. Since dark markets invite low affect relationships to develop, the absence of personal familiarity isn't problematic. This is because the expectations between vendors and buyers are relatively simple and specific, even if the nature of their endeavor is anything but. The focus of trust thus isn't purely on the individual with whom a familiarity develops. It's a systemic trust where users rely on all the technologies and practices designed to inspire trust. For example, a user's expectations are shaped by the security and informational measures markets take, as these give them reasons to believe that a successful marketplace is within the operator's own self-interest. Similarly, the user's own familiarity with rating systems will make it transparent that vendors need to maintain good reputations to secure recurring revenue. This again provides a reason to believe that vendors with good reputations will stay honest. Granted, the reputation systems are still quite primitive compared to what they could be. For example, dark markets are plagued by vendor exit scams. That's when vendors first build up enough of a reputation to warrant a sizable order volume. Then they disappear with the payments for all outstanding orders without the intent to fulfill them. Some markets protect against this by requiring vendor bonds. Vendors then need to maintain a certain deposit with the market to be granted access to the market. If they still defraud their customer base, the deposit is then forfeited and used to compensate the affected buyers. Though sadly, some markets themselves have turned out to be exit scams, where the operators disappear with the deposits and/or all of the payments held in escrow. So there's still room for improvement. But just like how the informational ecosystem has grown more sophisticated, so will the systems designed to keep all the market participants' incentives aligned. For example, since so many users are affected by exit scams, the first markets to mitigate this risk will undoubtedly attract a large user base. One way to solve this problem would be to work with a system of deposits for markets, vendors, and buyers. All market players would have to put up collateral before they could engage with the market. And cryptography would again be the facilitating technology. Market operators could hold deposits to keep the vendors honest, but the vendors in turn could vote to have the deposit returned if the majority of them believed that the market operators no longer had their interests at heart. This would protect buyers from exit scams by vendors, and protect vendors from exit scams from markets. If payments were also directly made from buyers to vendors, without the market holding the payment in escrow, then this would also protect the buyer from exit scams from markets, completing the triangle of trust. These deposit schemes would be designed to lower the reward of cheating, thus lowering the likelihood of their occurrence. Such systems would of course require quite some ingenuity and creativity to get right. But if we've learned anything from dark markets, it's that we can trust in their ability to adapt with technical innovation and social systems that have stood the test of time.